It was just after midnight when Deputy Hale saw her for the first time. Standing on the edge of Interstate 75 with nothing but a duffel bag, a leather jacket, and a stare so vacant it cut through the fog like a blade. She didn't flinch when his cruiser slowed to a crawl. She didn't speak when he rolled the window down, just stared. Florida nights are humid, sticky, filled with the chirp of crickets and the smell of asphalt and rot. But that night felt like the beginning of something else. "Ma'am, you all right?" Hale had asked, hand resting on the edge of his holster. She blinked slowly. "Waiting on someone," she muttered. "They were supposed to pick me up." "Who?" She looked past him out into the trees. "Doesn't matter anymore." Her name was Aileen Wuornos, and in the months that followed, that name would paralyze a state, shatter families, and fill newspaper headlines with stories that felt too cruel, too calculating, to be carried out by one woman. But they were, and it started with a single shot. They called it self-defense. First, Richard Mallory was the first name on the list, a 51-year-old electronics store owner with a string of petty arrests and a tendency to disappear for days at a time. No one thought much of it when he didn't show up to open shop on November 30th, 1989. His body wouldn't be found for nearly 2 weeks. When they did find him, he was half buried beneath a sheet of plastic in the palmetto brush just off Highway 301. 3 gunshot wounds, 1 through the chest, the other 2 straight to the back. It was execution style. His car, stripped, abandoned, stolen. The woman they would later identify in possession of his things told police a different story. She claimed he picked her up, offered her money for sex, then tried to kill her, so she killed him first. Aileen would call it survival. The courts would call it murder. But what no one knew, what no one dared imagine, was that Richard Mallory wasn't the only one. He was just the first. Her life had always been built on bruises. Born in 1956 in Rochester, Michigan, Aileen Carol Pittman came into this world already sentenced. Her father, a convicted child molester, hanged himself in prison before she turned 1. Her mother abandoned her soon after. Raised by her grandparents, Aileen quickly became a ghost in her own home. Her grandfather beat her. Her grandmother drank until mornings blurred into nights. At age 11, she was trading sex for food. At 14, she was pregnant, raped by a friend of the family. The baby was taken from her. She never saw it again. By 15, she was living in the woods behind her high school. By 20, she was hitchhiking across the country, selling herself for survival. By 30, she landed in Florida. And at 33, she started killing. The men came in steady succession. Names scratched off in motel registries, wallets missing, cars stripped, bodies dumped like garbage along forgotten roads. David Spears was next, a 43-year-old construction worker, last seen leaving his job site in Winter Garden. When they found his body, it was nearly unrecognizable, nude, decomposed, riddled with 6.22 caliber bullets. 2 weeks later, they found Charles Carskadden, a 40-year-old rodeo worker, 9 bullet holes. Then Troy Burress, a delivery driver who never made it to his drop-off. 5 shots, left in the woods. Each one vanished under similar circumstances. Each one died with the same gun. Each one was, according to Aileen, about to do something terrible. "I wasn't a serial killer," she said in her taped confession. "I was a woman fighting for her life." The press gave her a name, the Damsel of Death, a roadside prostitute who turned on her Johns, stole their cars, and left behind a trail of bodies. But the truth was more complicated, because Aileen never worked alone. There was someone else, a shadow behind the shoulder. Her name was Tyria Moore. Tyria was soft where Aileen was sharp. Quiet, reserved, small town. They met in a Daytona lesbian bar in 1986 and were inseparable almost immediately. Aileen told friends she was in love for the first time. Tyria moved in days later. To Aileen, Tyria was her last chance at something good. To prosecutors, she was the key witness. Tyria denied knowing about the murders until the very end. She told detectives Aileen came home covered in dirt, blood, always angry, always crying. that she'd talk about men who deserved what they got. But when the walls closed in, Tyria flipped. She wore a wire. She called Aileen from a motel in Ocala and begged her to tell the truth, to clear her name. Aileen, still believing in love, confessed. Over the phone, told her everything. Detectives listened in silence. 7 men, 1 gun, and a woman who believed every kill was a cleansing. They were gonna rape me, she repeated. They were monsters. All of them. I just stopped them first. But the forensics disagreed. The ballistics lined up. There were no signs of struggle. Just execution. Just death. Aileen was arrested at a biker bar in Port Orange called The Last Resort. It was January 9th, 1991. She didn't run. She didn't fight. Just looked up and said, "About time." The arresting officer later recalled, "She looked tired. Not like someone caught, but like someone done running." The court didn't share that sentiment. Her trial for the murder of Richard Mallory began the following year. The other murders weren't part of that case, but prosecutors were allowed to use them as evidence of intent. It was unheard of. It was damning. Tyria testified. The jury took less than 2 hours. Guilty. She was sentenced to death. But the story didn't end there, because even after her conviction, Aileen refused to play the part of the monster they wanted her to be. She shouted at judges, called journalists vultures, claimed prison guards spit in her food and tortured her with noise at night. In her final interviews, her mind had cracked completely. "They're trying to kill me with sonic pressure," she said to a camera crew. "They want me to die with a bang, not a whimper." Still, she refused to beg. She refused to apologize. "I'd do it again," she spat in one courtroom appearance. "I have hate crawling through my system." On October 9th, 2002, at the age of 46, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection. Her last words? "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back, like Independence Day with Jesus. June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back." Then she closed her eyes and never opened them again. But the debate didn't die. Was Aileen a ruthless killer or a victim of trauma, broken by abuse, failed by every system meant to protect her? Was she hunting men, or was she finally fighting back? Her ashes were scattered under a tree in Michigan by her only friend, a woman named Dawn Botkins. And somewhere on the Florida highways, people still remember the roadside drifter with a gun in her waistband, rage in her heart, and a face no one could forget. Aileen Wuornos wasn't a monster. She was what happens when monsters go unchecked. Before the press got hold of her name, before the courtroom sketches made her infamous, Aileen Wuornos was just another ghost drifting along the highways of Florida. A woman with nothing but a thumb out and fury burning in her chest. To the truckers and drifters who passed her by, she was one of many, a blur in the heat haze. But to those who picked her up, she would become the last thing they ever saw. It was May 1990 when David Spears, a 43-year-old construction worker from Winter Garden, clocked out of his job site and vanished into thin air. His wife filed a missing person report 2 days later. He hadn't shown up for a dinner with his sister. He hadn't called in sick. And his truck was missing. At first, police thought he had just run off. Another stressed-out man deciding he couldn't carry the weight anymore. But then they found his body. 6 bullets tore through David's chest. His torso left out in the open like a warning, discarded in a patch of scrub off Highway 19. Nothing was stolen. No sign of a robbery. No defensive wounds. Just death. Cold, fast, and cruel. It was methodical, calculated. This was no crime of passion. This was something else. The detectives began to notice the pattern. Next came Charles Carskadden, a 40-year-old rodeo worker from Missouri. He'd been on his way to visit family in Tampa. Instead, they found him in a ditch outside Pasco County. 9 gunshot wounds. His car was never recovered. The autopsy revealed he never even got the chance to fight back. Then Troy Burress, a delivery driver from Ocala. His boss said he left the warehouse around 11 a.m. with a full load. When he didn't return, calls went unanswered. A week later, a hiker stumbled across his decomposing body in a clearing off Highway 19. 5 shots. The gun was always the same, a .22 caliber pistol. It was around this time that Florida law enforcement realized they had a problem. They weren't looking for a one-off killer. They were looking for a pattern. Predator. Aileen, meanwhile, was living out of motels and abandoned buildings with Tyria Moore, the quiet, soft-spoken woman she called her soulmate. Their relationship was strange, uneven. Aileen was volatile, impulsive, prone to rants and sudden laughter. Tyria watched quietly from the shadows, often afraid to speak. But Aileen adored her. Everything she did, she claimed, was for Tyria. In the evenings, Aileen would disappear to hitch rides along the highway. Sex for money, sex for shelter, sex for survival. But somewhere along the line, that arrangement began to shift. The fear she claimed to feel became her justification. She told Tyria about men who tried to rape her, men who threatened her, men who forced her hand. At first, Tyria didn't ask questions. She didn't want to know where the new wallets came from, or the bloody clothes, or the sudden influx of cash. She told herself Aileen was just hustling harder, that maybe the stories were true. But in the silence between motel walls, doubt began to grow. Aileen began to drink more. Her rants became darker. She talked about death like it was a form of deliverance. She boasted about how she taught them a lesson. Still, Tyria stayed. Love makes monsters easier to believe. The murders didn't stop. In September, police found the body of Charles Dick Humphreys, a 56-year-old retired Air Force major and former police chief. He was fully clothed, lying face up in the woods, shot 7 times. Unlike the others, he hadn't been stripped. A sign, perhaps, that Aileen was losing her grip. Or maybe the rage was shifting from survival to punishment. Weeks later, Walter Antonio, a part-time security guard and reserve deputy, was found near a remote logging road. For bullets, his badge was missing. By now, the killings were unmistakable. Florida law enforcement launched a task force. Multiple counties were involved. Victims were spread across vast stretches of highway. But there was one link. All the men had been last seen alive with a woman. A drifter, blonde, lean, armed. They didn't know her name, but they would. In July of 1990, police recovered a stolen car belonging to Peter Seams, a man who had vanished while driving to New Jersey. His body was never found, but the car was crashed and abandoned. Inside were fingerprints, and witnesses reported seeing 2 women fleeing the scene. One was described as heavyset, the other thin, blonde, and aggressive. Fingerprints led to a name, Aileen Wuornos. The hunt was on, but Aileen didn't run. She lingered. She drank at the same bars, walked the same stretches of road, trusted too many faces. The weight of her actions hadn't fully sunk in. But Tyria? She was terrified. She could feel the net tightening. And when the police finally brought her in, she cracked. They promised her immunity if she helped. So she picked up the phone. She called Aileen and said she was scared, said she needed to know the truth. What followed was a confession that chilled even the most seasoned officers. Aileen admitted to everything, not with guilt, but with conviction. They were gonna hurt me, she said. Every one of them. I did what I had to do. She called it justice. They called it murder. By January 1991, Aileen was arrested at the Last Resort Bar. It was a dusty place in Port Orange, a hangout for bikers and outlaws. She was sitting alone, drinking from a plastic cup. When the police walked in, she didn't fight. She just looked up and said, "I knew this day would come." But even then, the story was far from over. Because the world wasn't ready for what Aileen had to say, or how she would say it. This wasn't just a case about murder. It was about pain, betrayal, and a fury that had waited decades to erupt. And in the next chapter, that fury would take the stand. The Florida sun blazed down on the highway as if it were trying to burn away the secrets buried in the asphalt. By January 1990, the police were no longer dealing with just a missing person or an abandoned car. They were looking at a pattern. A string of dead men left scattered across Florida's highways. And all signs, all fingerprints, all ballistics, led to one woman, Aileen Wuornos. But no one knew her name. Not yet. Aileen didn't see herself as a killer. In her mind, she was surviving, fighting back. Every man she encountered on those roads, every client she lured under the guise of sex work, she believed they were all the same, dangerous, threatening, and in her eyes, she had no choice. Her weapon of choice was a .22 caliber revolver, small, concealable, and deadly at close range. She kept it in her bag, tucked beside cigarettes, a lighter, and a Bible. Irony dripped from every detail of her life. After killing Charles Carskadden in late May, she dumped his body off Route 19. He was a part-time rodeo worker, just 40 years old. His remains were found weeks later, badly decomposed, the cause of death. Multiple gunshot wounds to the torso. The brutality wasn't random. It was methodical. She shot to stop, then shot to kill. Then took whatever she could. She stole his car like the others. She pawned his belongings. She signed with a fake name, but the ID she used was barely forged. In her desperation, Aileen had become sloppy. Back in Daytona Beach, she and Tyria Moore were living in motels, often switching between cheap roadside rooms and friends' couches. They'd argue about money, about drinking, about the noise Aileen brought into their lives. "I don't want to hear about it," Tyria would say, burying her head into a pillow when Aileen returned late and drunk. "I'm doing this for us," Aileen would slur. "You want to eat or not?" But Tyria was growing restless. She suspected more than Aileen was willing to admit, and eventually she stopped asking. Meanwhile, police across counties were building a profile. Victims were all middle-aged men, all found shot multiple times. All had been seen picking up a hitchhiker, a woman, alone. The media started whispering about a female serial killer. That's when things turned. In July 1990, Aileen murdered Peter Seams, a 65-year-old missionary. But this one was different. His body was never found. Only his car turned up. And fingerprints, finally clear ones, were lifted from the interior. Those prints would be her undoing. Because in the system, buried beneath petty charges and misdemeanors, those fingerprints matched one name, Aileen Carol Wuornos. And so the hunt began. The police plastered her mugshot across state lines. Bars, gas stations, truck stops, anywhere a loner or a drifter might pass through. Tips began pouring in, some false, some eerily accurate. But Aileen wasn't hiding. She was on the move, still hustling, still searching for rides, still pulling cons. She didn't realize that every move she made brought her closer to the edge. And Tyria? She had had enough. One night, Tyria called her sister, then packed a small bag and left the room while Aileen was out buying beer. When Aileen returned and found her gone, something cracked. "She was all I had," she muttered to the motel clerk the next morning. "And she left like I was nothing. Aileen was unraveling, and the police were closing in. They didn't need to catch her red-handed. They just needed one more mistake. She gave it to them on January 9th, 1991. Aileen walked into a biker bar in Port Orange, Florida. She sat at the end, ordered a beer, lit a cigarette, and chatted with a stranger. She didn't notice the plainclothes officers watching her every move. They had her prints. They had her name. And now they had her. The arrest was quiet, calm. Aileen didn't fight. She looked up at the officer and asked, "You gonna let me finish my beer?" They did. But the chase wasn't over. It was only beginning, because the police had a bigger problem than catching her. They needed her to talk. And the key to breaking Aileen was Tyria. The interrogation room was cold, not just from the air conditioning that buzzed through the vents above, but from the way the walls seemed to close in, sterile and judgmental. Aileen sat shackled to the steel chair, her wrists raw from the cuffs, her eyes darting like a cornered animal. She'd been in rooms like this before, but this one was different. This time, they weren't charging her with theft or solicitation. This time, they wanted blood. They didn't ask her about one murder. They asked about 7. The detectives slid photos across the table, one after another. Each face a man who had vanished from Florida roads. Preacher, a rodeo worker, part-time sausage delivery man, a retired Air Force major. The names blended together in Eileen's mind. They were the ghosts she carried, and now they were staring back at her. But she didn't speak. Not at first. Across the city, in a hotel room rented under a different name, Tyria Moore sat wrapped in silence. The woman who had once shared Eileen's life, who had cried in her arms and laughed over cheap fast food dinners, was now the state's only hope of a confession. Detectives promised her immunity if she could get Aileen to talk, and she agreed. For 3 days, they wired her hotel phone. Tyria called Aileen at the jail, her voice trembling each time she picked up. She said she was scared, that she couldn't eat, that she needed to hear Aileen say it, out loud. "I can't sleep," Tyria whispered. "Tell me the truth, Lee, please." There was a pause, then a breath, then Eileen's voice, slow and heavy. "They had it comin'. You know that." Each call chipped away at her defenses. She thought she was protecting Tyria, that if she took the blame, Tyria could walk away free. But in truth, she was already unraveling. Her voice cracked under the pressure, the loneliness, the betrayal. By the 4th day, she said it plainly. "Yeah, I killed them. All of them." And with those words, the case was sealed. The news hit the airwaves like a bomb. Female serial killer confesses to 7 murders. Reporters flooded the courthouse. Tabloids printed her photo beneath screaming headlines. She was a sensation, not because she was a killer, but because she was a woman who murdered like a man, without remorse. But Aileen wasn't a monster in her mind. She was a survivor. She said every killing was in self-defense, that these men tried to rape her, that they beat her, that they deserved it. The state disagreed. In July 1991, the first trial began. Richard Mallory's murder was the opening case. He was a shop owner with a criminal record of his own. But the prosecution painted him as a victim, Aileen as a predator. She wore second-hand clothes, sat alone beside her public defenders. The jury didn't see a broken woman. They saw the face on the front page, the killer. When the guilty verdict came, she didn't flinch. "I'm used to people judging me," she told a reporter later. "Hell, I judged myself harder than any of them." One trial turned into many, each one ending the same. Guilty, 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 until she had 6 death sentences. 6, a record for any woman in the United States. Her time on death row was filled with rage, reflection, and interviews. She spoke to journalists, filmmakers, and spiritual advisors. One day she'd curse the state. The next, she'd sob about her childhood, about the abuse, the rape, the way the world turned its back. "I was made into this," she once said. "Y'all act like I woke up one day and chose murder. You make a girl live in hell, and she learns to fight with fire." But behind her anger, there was a deep, hollow sadness. She wrote letters to Tyria, some angry, some pleading, some written in a scrawl that barely resembled words. Tyria never replied. Aileen began to spiral. Her mental health deteriorated rapidly. She became paranoid, believed the prison was poisoning her food, that people were tormenting her through the plumbing, that death was a release she welcomed. In her final interviews, her eyes were wild, her words erratic. "I'm glad they're killing me," she told a documentarian, "'cause I'd do it again. I got no regrets. None." But then she'd pause, and in that silence, you could almost hear the little girl she once was, crying for someone to listen. On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. She was 46 years old. Her last meal? Cup of coffee. Her last words? "Yes, I would just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back." And then she was gone. But her story lingered. In the headlines, in documentaries, in film, she became myth and cautionary tale. A woman shaped by trauma, hardened by the streets, and pushed beyond the edge. Some saw her as a monster, others as a tragedy. But no one could look away. Before she was a headline, before she was Florida's most infamous woman on death row, Aileen Wuornos was just a child born into chaos. Her story didn't start with bloodshed. It started in a small, cold house in Rochester, Michigan. The walls were thin, the screams were loud, and the love, if it existed, was buried beneath years of abuse, abandonment, and neglect. Aileen was born in February 1956 to teenage parents. Her father, Leo, was a diagnosed schizophrenic who spent most of his life in and out of prison. He eventually hanged himself while serving time for child molestation. Her mother, Diane, abandoned Aileen and her brother Keith when Aileen was just a toddler, leaving them in the care of their grandparents, Lori and Britta Wuornos. But if she thought she had found safety, she was wrong. Lori was an alcoholic with a violent temper. Britta tried to hold the household together, but she was frail, sick more often than well. And Aileen? She was left to fend for herself. By age 11, she was exchanging sexual favors for food, cigarettes, and affection. By 14, she was pregnant, the result of a rape by one of her grandfather's friends. She gave birth in a home for unwed mothers. The child was taken away. She never saw it again. When Britta died, Lori threw Aileen out of the house. Just 15 years old and homeless, she slept in abandoned cars, stole food from gas stations, and wandered the cold streets of Michigan with frostbitten hands and blistered feet. She never went back to school. She never had a childhood. She became a drifter, a hitchhiker, a streetwalker. From Michigan to Colorado to Florida, she survived the only way she knew how, with her fists, her body, and her rage. Years later, when the world saw the mugshots and the courtroom tantrums, they didn't see the child. They saw the killer. But the woman in those photos was built layer by layer, not born. She was built in alleyways, on cold bathroom tiles, in the back seats of strangers' cars. Every insult, every punch, every unwanted touch hardened her, turned her pain into armor. Aileen told interviewers that every man she killed tried to rape her, that every one of them saw her not as a human being, but as an object, that they wanted to use her, hurt her, maybe even kill her. And maybe some of them did. The truth became murky. The line between victim and perpetrator blurred. Forensic evidence, police reports, and the testimonies didn't always support her claims. But that didn't mean the trauma wasn't real. It just meant it was buried deeper. Her lovers said she was paranoid, quick to anger, prone to outbursts that seemed to come from nowhere. Tyria Moore once said, "You never knew which version of Lee you were going to get. One moment she'd be calm, tender. The next, she'd be throwing chairs or threatening to kill someone. It was like watching a storm build in slow motion, knowing you couldn't stop it. And yet, people were drawn to her. Maybe it was her brokenness. Maybe it was her fire. Maybe they saw something in her that reminded them of their own wounds. But no one could fix her. Not Tyria, not the lawyers, not the reporters who tried to capture her soul on camera." In prison, Aileen began to change. Or maybe she just stopped pretending. She became more erratic, more combative. She accused the guards of feeding her poison. She said they were trying to drive her insane. And some believed they succeeded. Her mental health evaluations showed signs of severe borderline personality disorder, PTSD, antisocial traits. But even the doctors couldn't agree on how much was illness and how much was choice. Was she insane? Was she evil? Or was she simply a woman who had been broken too many times? Before her execution, she gave away most of her possessions. Books, artwork, letters. Some ended up in the hands of collectors. Others were destroyed. But one thing remained. Her story. A story that forced the country to look in the mirror and ask uncomfortable questions. What do we do with the people we fail to protect? What happens when the wounded learn to wound others? And is justice the same for everyone, or only those society deems worth saving? Aileen Wuornos didn't die with peace. She died with defiance. But in that defiance was a truth the world couldn't ignore. She wasn't the first woman to kill, but she was the first the world couldn't forget. The day after Aileen's execution, Florida State Prison returned to its usual grim quiet. Outside, the media vans packed up their cameras. Their lights dimmed, and the reporters moved on to the next big story. But inside, Aileen's empty cell remained. For the guards, it was just another execution, another file closed. But for those who followed her story closely, her death left behind a haunting silence that felt more like a warning than an ending. In the years that followed, Aileen Wuornos became more than just a headline. She became a symbol, a case study, a point of debate in classrooms, courtrooms, and advocacy groups. Some called her the first true female serial killer in American history. Others insisted she was a victim of a brutal system, one that punished women who dared to fight back. Documentaries began to circulate. The Selling of a Serial Killer, Life and Death of a Serial Killer, each offering a deeper look into her psyche, her past, and the web of trauma that shaped her. In many ways, Aileen's story didn't die with her. It only became louder. Tyria Moore, the woman who once shared Aileen's life, remained silent. She disappeared from public view, never once appearing in any documentary or speaking to the press after the trial. To some, she was a key witness. To others, the ultimate betrayer. But no one knew what became of her. It was as if the truth about their relationship died with Aileen. But the letters remained. Aileen had written dozens of them from death row. Some filled with anger, others with desperate pleas for understanding. Many were sent to journalists, to spiritual counselors, to people she had never met. Each one a piece of her fractured mind. In one letter, she wrote, "I never wanted to be a killer. I just wanted to survive. Every man I met tried to hurt me, and one day I just broke. I broke, and I never came back." That line, "I broke, and I never came back," appeared again and again, almost like she was trying to explain something that even she didn't fully understand. Criminologists studied her life like a textbook. Born into trauma, raised in chaos, abused, discarded, and forced to survive by any means. By the time she picked up a gun, many argued the system had already failed her 100 times. But that didn't erase the truth. 7 men were dead, and in the eyes of the law, Aileen was responsible. Her story stirred national conversations about mental health, abuse, the death penalty, and how women are treated differently in the justice system. Some people painted her as a feminist vigilante, striking down would-be rapists. Others saw only a manipulative killer, hiding behind excuses. The truth, like most things, was somewhere in between. At a symposium on female criminality held at the University of Florida, a professor said, "Aileen Wuornos forces us to confront the uncomfortable. She challenges our definitions of victimhood and villainy. She is the blurred line between the two." In a rare interview years later, one of Aileen's former public defenders described her as the most complex client I've ever had. One moment she was this broken woman begging for mercy. The next she was spitting fire at the world. I don't think she ever felt safe. Not for a single day in her life. What haunted people most wasn't the fact that Aileen killed. It was why she killed. The pattern, the escalation, the rage that simmered beneath the surface. But also the moments, brief, flickering, where she seemed human. When she cried about her childhood. When she asked for a Bible. When she talked about wanting to be reborn. There's a photo that made its rounds online years after her death. A grainy, candid shot of Aileen as a young teen, sitting on a swing in a rundown Michigan trailer park. She's not smiling, but her eyes are open wide, curious, searching. People look at that photo and wonder, was that the last moment she was still innocent? The answer may never be known. What is known is that Aileen Wuornos left a mark. Not just in the criminal justice system, but in the minds of everyone who heard her story. She was studied, dissected, judged, but never forgotten. On the 20th anniversary of her execution, a podcast dedicated an entire series to her case. The host ended the final episode with these words: "She wasn't the beginning, and she won't be the end." Aileen Wuornos was a reflection of what happens when pain goes untreated, when cries for help go unanswered, when the line between defense and vengeance fades into dust. Today, there are still people who visit her grave. Some leave flowers, others, letters. One person left a worn-out teddy bear with a note tucked inside. It read, "I don't know if you were evil or just broken. Maybe both. But I hope you finally found peace." And maybe, just maybe, she did.